Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Falcon Dish, your news and opinion podcast for all things Star Wars. I am your host, Jason Thomas Scott, also known as JTS, and I'm coming to you here. It is now Tuesday, the 29th of May, 2018. I hope everybody had a good Memorial Day weekend. I bet some of you may have, made hot dogs and hamburgers, did a little barbecue, maybe got some chips, maybe posted some nice messages for veterans on your Facebook pages, maybe got together with friends and family, maybe drank some booze, chatted, enjoyed the nice weather. But apparently, it seems a great many of you did not go see Solo, a Star Wars Story. That's right. Over the weekend, we had the debut of the newest Disney-produced Star Wars spin-off film, one of the anthology Star Wars stories, all about our favorite Star Wars character, Han Solo. And apparently, lo and behold, we now have the very first Star Wars branded motion picture that just did not do gangbusters at the box office. I think the newest returns indicate that over the weekend it made approximately $83 million in the U.S. and Canada, about $103 million in total for the quote-unquote 4-day holiday weekend. And the way they get that total is they add up the Thursday night previews in addition to the full 3-day weekend. So kind of disappointing for the folks over at Disney. I'm pretty sure the bean counters are kind of scratching their heads and trying to figure out what the heck happened. How come nobody came to a Star Wars movie? Because obviously the brand is or at least it has been pretty much infallible over the course of the last 40 years. Even when George Lucas decided to come on back in the 1990s, late 90s and early 2000s and create the not as well-received prequel trilogy, its box office numbers were still pretty decent. In fact, even before adjusting for inflation, my understanding is the majority of the prequel films also outpaced or outgrossed Solo this weekend. So I guess people just did not go. And I've been hearing from friends that did go to see the film, that paid money to go, that when they got into the theater, even on Thursday evening, even the preview screenings, it used to be like you had to, wait until midnight in order to be able to see the film. Now you can go, it starts at like 6 p.m. or something in most of these theaters. It was on something like 4,300 screens, so it's not like it isn't an available film-going option over your nice long holiday weekend on which you don't have anything to do except, eat barbecue. But friends of mine, they tell me the theater was not full. In fact, maybe like 20, 30 people in theaters that can hold, a couple hundred people or more. People just did not go see the movie. Now, if you look at the box office total of, 103 million, and then compare that with the box office totals over the weekends of the opening of the other Disney-produced Star Wars feature films, including The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi, or even Rogue One, they were all at 150 million, 200 million, 220 million, 250 million, very, very large box office totals. In fact, The Force Awakens, if I'm not mistaken, is actually the biggest opening weekend of all time. So the audience was not there. And in fact, if you look at those numbers, it kind of feels as if about half the audience was not there. And the thing that I think may have occurred, because everybody is trying to scratch their heads over at Disney. Everybody's pontificating in all of the trades. The Hollywood Reporter is getting involved, Variety's getting involved, all these entertainment sites, Polygon, whatever. They're all trying to figure out, what happened? Here's the reason. And, one answer is, it's just a really competitive time at the box office right now because it's summer and you've got Deadpool 2 and you have Avengers Infinity War still going strong even a month later. And, it's just people don't have enough money right now that, to stretch it out to see every movie they may want to see. Some people are saying that, the advertising wasn't very good. The ads for it didn't make the film look good. So it's the marketing department's problem and the fact that they didn't even start advertising it until about maybe a month or so ago. Some people are saying, oh, well, it's only been 5 months since the last Star Wars movie, so it's probably Star Wars fatigue. People don't want to see, 2, maybe 3 Star Wars movies a year because it's not like Marvel. Although I'll tell you what, Black Panther, Avengers, I think you've got, Ant-Man and the Wasp. There's usually 2 to 3 Marvel films a year, and every single one of those makes $1 billion. I don't think it's fatigue. So what it circles back to in my mind, the reason behind why Solo: A Star Wars Story did not perform at the box office over this weekend is because, in my humble opinion, half the Star Wars fan base did not go out of protest because of how upset they were over The Last Jedi. I'm willing to bet that 50% of the Star Wars fan base did not attend Solo simply because they felt that burnt and they wanted to, in a way, I guess, teach Disney a lesson or, influence their next moves with regard to the property. Now, I myself on this pod, other friends of mine, we've all discussed the fact that, a Solo movie, a Han Solo origin story was not something that we felt we needed, not something that we felt that we wanted. We were, not anticipating this film. It wasn't something that we were looking forward to. We were very, very worried that they might ruin it, that there was a palpable fear, especially with a lot of the production rumors that came out, a lot of the information that we learned that, there were some severe production problems. The original directors were canned, that Kathy Kennedy got really hands-on and brought in Ron Howard to kind of, right the ship, that the Kasdans weren't pleased with how things were progressing, that their script wasn't being followed, just a problematic production, and that Disney literally sunk an additional $200 million into the thing in order to basically reshoot upwards of 70, perhaps 80% of the film all over again after already shooting for about 4 or 5 months. So that is also relatively unheard of. It's not unheard of that a film goes through, production tweaks like that. It's not unheard of for them to have reshoots. Almost every movie nowadays has reshoots because they'll do test audience screenings and they'll take those notes and go back to the drawing board a little bit. And, especially with the ending of the film, they'll change some things around. But this was a wholesale reshoot of the film. And as discussed in the previous podcast, we talked about Alden Ehrenreich and the fact that apparently they were bringing in, an acting coach for the guy and how embarrassing that must have been for him on set. The fact that his relationship with Lord and Miller, the original directors of the film, that relationship no longer existed for him on set, so he had to start completely over from scratch with Ron Howard and try and prove himself again, even though he was literally sitting on a 3-picture deal that Disney had signed with him. So the whole thing was just kind of a mess. And unfortunately, here is the greatest inherent irony of all of the entire situation from my perspective. The movie is actually not half bad. I didn't pay for it. I didn't go to a movie theater, so I don't know, whether or not it was crowded this weekend. I take that back. I was in a movie theater, but I saw a screening through a guild that I belong to. So I was surrounded by other, filmmaking and TV professionals watching for free as part of, the kicks of being involved in the industry. And it seemed to me that for the most part, the audience that I watched it with, they all seemed to generally enjoy it. I mean, there was, smatterings of applause. There was laughter. There was applause at the end, and it may have been polite applause in case, anybody wanted to make sure and save face in case somebody was there that had helped make the movie. But, it was an enjoyable experience. I came out of Solo with a smile on my face. I'll be honest, I was actually pleasantly surprised. And a lot of the elements that I was, most fearful of as far as how they would treat the character of Han Solo, whether or not Alden Ehrenreich would be able to do justice to the character, whether his performance would be up to snuff. Most of those concerns were, quelled by the picture. The movie was actually pretty good. I remember being really scared when They had announced Daniel Craig as the new James Bond, and I was thinking, oh my God, how can you go from Pierce Brosnan, who's like this, he's basically an underwear model, he's like so attractive and so, charming, even though the movies he was in weren't that great. And then how could you go to Daniel Craig, who just looked kind of, gangly and strange, and he was blonde and so pale, and he just didn't come across as a James Bond at all to me. But then when I saw Casino Royale, he, within like 20 minutes, was pretty much, the greatest James Bond of, I think, the entire series, other than perhaps Sean Connery, who had defined the role all those years ago. So looking at Alden Ehrenreich and his performance as Han Solo, I bought him as Han Solo. While I was watching the film, about 20 minutes or so in, I just sort of accepted him as Han Solo. I could see the quirks, his little face, his facial quirks that he had, how he would kind of talk out of the side of his mouth a little bit, the way that Harrison Ford sometimes does, the looks that he would give other characters, the way he would rest his fingertips or his thumbs on his belt as he walked around, the way that he held his blaster as he was shooting at other characters, just basically how he handled himself in each situation, how he was sarcastic, but he was confident and overly confident. But what was kind of fun about it was he was overly confident in a far more cheerful way. He wasn't as burned and damaged, I think, as the later Han Solo, the more grisly version, could be. Still doesn't really make a lot of sense to me in my mind timeline-wise, because, again, age difference here is nil compared when Harrison Ford originally took on the role in 1977 versus Alden now. They're basically the same age. So my understanding of the timeline is that Solo, A Star Wars Story, is to take place about 10 years in advance of A New Hope. But I don't know, it looks like 10 minutes before A New Hope as far as what's happening in this picture. But Alden pulled it off. I got to give the guy props. I was impressed. I thought he did just fine. And then the real heart of the film, are those relationships, especially between him and Chewbacca. Spoilers, I guess, because this is turning into a little bit of a review here, but how Chewbacca is introduced and how Han and Chewie first meet, how they meet cute, is actually pretty well handled. There's a humor moment that is entwined with it, which is kind of cheesy, in which, Han Solo is trying to speak, I guess it's Shuriwook, the Wookiee language of Kashyyyk, and how he knows that, who the hell knows? Everybody in Star Wars just seems to know how to speak droid or several other languages, even if they're just raised on some backwater planet somewhere. And we see that, Han Solo, as we've known, comes from Corellia. Oddly, in the picture, Corellia is handled not as a, beautiful planet as it had been previously kind of described in Star Wars Legends lore now. But it's sort of this hellhole that people want to escape from, in which this horrible creature named Lady Proxima, which is also possibly the other not as fantastic humor moment of the film, the way that she's introduced. Lady Proxima is running the thing down on Corellia, and Han is basically indebted to her somehow, being raised as an orphan by her and her criminal organization, and so he's running around doing errands for her, as are other men and women, young people on Corellia, including his love interest, Kira, who we are introduced to, who is basically, what's her name? Mother of Dragons from Game of Thrones. So the relationships between Han and the other characters, they develop pretty nicely, but it's the Han and Chewie stuff I felt that, was the heart of the film and worked best for me. The other relationship being between Han and Lando Calrissian. Now, as we had discussed in the pod previously, Donald Glover portrays Lando, and I thought he did a pretty darn good job. I think his portrayal was probably a little bit more like an impersonation of Billy D. Williams than Alden's was of Harrison Ford, but it was fine. In fact, with both of them, with both Han Solo and with Lando Calrissian, I kind of just believed that they were the younger versions of those characters. They they basically nailed those characters. And when they meet, and it's the sabacc game, I wasn't too keen on the montage way that they shot that scene. I mean, speaking of Casino Royale, it was kind of like that, where the two of them are, playing cards, and so what do you cut to? And then you just sort of jump cut between, their gameplay until one of them either loses or wins. And it was, so the scene was fine. The alien characters and creatures and things surrounding them were kind of interesting and fun. It was probably shot a little too darkly, as is much of the film for some strange reason, but the creatures were fun. Their interaction was great. The dialogue between them and how they handle themselves and interact with each other, you could tell right off of the bat that there's sort of an adversarial thing going on there, a competitive thing, which is kind of fun. And they're joshing one another. They're giving each other a hard time. But yet at the same time, you can tell that they both kind of mutually respect one another to a certain extent and are, willing to deal with one another. And their friendship, if you can call it that, stays adversarial like that, but is based on mutual benefit. The two of them do cooperate, and most of it is, based on greed. It's based on them trying to swindle somebody, so they pair up, they team up to do swindling together. So, like I said, it's funny because I was pleasantly surprised. Solo is actually not a horrible film. I would actually probably rank it pretty high. It would probably come in somewhere in the middle. I know that we discussed the ranking of the films in the last podcast. And, obviously, things like the prequels are kind of towards the bottom, as is, in my opinion, The Last Jedi, whereas, the original trilogy and especially A New Hope and Empire rank, clear at the top. And then you kind of have stuff sort of just falling in the middle. I would put Solo kind of somewhere in the middle, probably under Rogue One, but probably most certainly above things like Revenge of the Sith or, other lesser Star Wars pictures. I had a fun time with it. It's not the most memorable film. It's not going to win any Oscars, I don't think. It's not, blow the barn doors off, but it was fine. It was perfectly fine. And so the irony here is that Star Wars fandom, like I said, I feel as though about half of the Star Wars fans did not show up purposefully in order to burn Disney, or they're just burnt out on Star Wars right now. They're angry over The Last Jedi and how The Last Jedi treated the fan base. So they're just like, no, I'm not going to go hand them more of my hard-earned money right now until they get their act together. And I don't want to see them desecrate, more about the characters I love. I don't want to see them ruin Han Solo or ruin Lando or any of these kinds of things. Well, again, the irony is they're missing out. The picture's actually pretty decent. It's pretty fun. I think that the majority of Star Wars fans would actually enjoy the movie just fine. So maybe some people will check it out, during the week and into next weekend. I don't think anything else too huge opens for at least another couple of weeks. You've got The Incredibles 2 coming out in June, mid-June. I think it's the 15th. And following that, you're going to have Jurassic World Part 2, so I'm sure that's going to be huge. But in the interim here, for the next couple of weeks, I think there's some breathing room. I'm sure Infinity War will continue to make money. I'm sure, Deadpool will continue to make money. But there's room, I think, for people to possibly check out Star Wars based on, hopefully, positive word of mouth. I'm not sure. I think a lot of the reviews that I've seen that are posted on, Rotten Tomatoes, the movie has not performed that well reviews-wise, which is, again, interesting and ironic to me, considering that The Last Jedi, I want to say, garnered somewhere in the neighborhood of a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes as far as, how that picture was reviewed. Whereas I believe right now Solo is hovering somewhere in the the low 70s. I think it's like 71, something like that, on Rotten Tomatoes as we speak. So barely fresh based on their ratings. And I find that interesting because I kind of feel that the Solo picture kind of expands the universe in interesting ways. A lot of the world building that's involved in the movie kind of fleshed out a lot of the Star Wars world, especially the underworld, especially the criminal underbelly You see a little bit of that with the bounty hunters in Empire Strikes Back. You see a lot more of that with Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi, but it's not really an aspect that we spend a lot of time with in the motion pictures. And so this was kind of interesting because it's a smaller scale story. This isn't about, the galactic war between, this rebellion trying to fight off this giant galactic empire. If anything, it's literally just about these few characters and them, trying to pull off a series of heists, which, it's kind of a strange feeling to try and combine something like an Ocean's 11-ish kind of a storyline into the Star Wars universe, because normally we're dealing with, much larger projects like taking down a Death Star as opposed to robbing a train. What's interesting to me about that as well is, they have spaceships, so I'm not sure I understand why they need a train to transport something from one end of one planet to another when they're literally attacking said train with a spaceship to steal the items off the train. But I digress. It made for an interesting scene. It was fun visually. It gave everybody something to do. And it was something that we had not yet seen before. So, kudos there, showing off something fresh, I guess, even though it's actually the most cliched thing in the world in other movies, but it's fresh to the Star Wars universe. And the criminal underworld aspects, permeate the film to such an extent that even the very, I guess it's not very controversial, the semi-controversial inclusion of a prequel-era character in the closing of the film has to do with this criminal underworld and who's running it. And so, again, spoilers, if you haven't seen the movie, I don't know why you're listening to this if you haven't. The character that is revealed at the end of the picture that's running the entire shebang is Darth Maul, of all people. And so I guess that's Disney's way of trying to be as inclusory as possible of the uber Star Wars nerds that know that Darth Maul is still alive because they've bothered to read all of the comics and seen all of the cartoon TV shows and kept up with the stories over the years, whereas your average Star Wars moviegoer who, doesn't. Last time they saw Darth Maul was in The Phantom Menace in 1989, getting cut in half by Obi-Wan Kenobi and falling to his death and, and from their perspective, never to be heard from again. So seeing him show up in sort of a cheesy way at the end, he's doing his video conference call Skype hologram with Kira. And then he even ignites his lightsaber for no reason, just to kind of show, like, yep, he's still got a double-bladed lightsaber, so that's threatening. It's kind of bizarre, but kind of interesting and unexpected and kind of fun. So I'm sure, at this point, Disney is thinking, oh, well, we need to utilize, existing canon and existing characters. Who is somebody that's, popular, that has been underutilized in the past, especially in the films, and who can we kind of use to expand this universe? And I guess, they pulled his name out of a hat. Here comes Darth Maul. So I anticipate that Darth Maul's inclusion indicates that he will be utilized in the upcoming Obi-Wan Kenobi film and possibly Solo sequels. But here's where things get interesting. According to the trades today, the folks over at Disney, they're kind of freaking out. The box office being what it's been for Solo has, put the fear of God in them. They've realized that they cannot stretch Star Wars to the same extent that they have stretched the Marvel license and that cinematic universe. I think that they are slowly realizing that not only does the Marvel model not work with regard to film releases and the fact that, we can pump 2 or 3 of these things out a year. No, it doesn't work. But they're also realizing that the Marvel sense of things, the Marvel humor, and the inclusion of that in something like The Last Jedi also does not work for this fan base. I think what they are forgetting, and again, this is, obviously my opinion, I think what they are forgetting is that Star Wars fans take Star Wars relatively seriously. Yes, it's literally space wizards hitting each other with glow sticks, but the old Star Wars pictures, took that world relatively seriously. There was humor, there was fun. Chewie is a funny character, R2-D2 and C-3PO, and their banter is funny. But for the most part, it was, it's a war going on, and these people are trying to survive, and they're battling in this galaxy, and the, family dynamics of Star Wars, the drama of discovery with Luke discovering himself and who he is, and finding out, who Darth Vader is, and fighting him nearly to the death, and trying to save those he loves, and, these are very large, dynamic issues taking place in this galaxy far, far away. That's a very different tone than, starting off your movie with Poe Dameron making fun of your mom, like making your mom jokes and making phone call jokes like, "Can you hear me now?" And, it does not jive with what we've come to expect from Star Wars. And when something is that jarring, it's immediately disliked because it doesn't feel comfortable. Now, arguably, Star Wars, in order to break away and move in new directions and to have new filmmakers and new voices and new stories, of course, you need to, change things up. You can't do the same thing over and over and over. But you do need to maintain tone, I would argue. And one of the things that I appreciated, for the most part, about this new picture Solo is that they achieved a tone that kind of made sense within context for what the picture was about. And even though it was a heist picture and therefore slightly different, they kept the world pretty much as is. It felt more like Star Wars, at least to me, than something like The Last Jedi did for much of its length. And I think that Ron Howard and the Kasdans probably have quite a bit to do with that. Ron Howard, growing up, he grew up in the industry. He was actually directed by George Lucas in American Graffiti. So it's kind of fun to see him turn around and direct George Lucas's baby, 40 years hence. And I think that he brought, a competent, capable sensibility to it, a workmanship type of thing where, he came in and punched his punch clock card and put in his time and made a movie. And he knew what Star Wars was, and he tried to make a Star Wars movie, and it feels like a Star Wars movie. What I also appreciated is it also felt like a little bit of a Ron Howard movie. There were Ron Howard elements in the picture, such as they're Corellian hounds. I'm not entirely sure I understood what kind of dogs or beasts they were, but there were dog-like beasts chasing after the cars in the car chase at the beginning that looked pretty much as though they had been lifted directly out of his film Willow that he had also directed for Lucasfilm back in, I think it was 1988, I want to say. And the car chases, that comes right out of, Grand Theft Auto, the fact that the car that Solo uses looks like a Ford or something, is sort of like a Harrison Ford joke, as well as a kind of an in-joke to the American Graffiti stuff. It was fun. It feels like a Ron Howard movie. It's a feel-good movie. It's not too down and dour. The one aspect that I would argue is kind of dour about the film, and it weirds me out, is the cinematography. The cinematographer is the same person who also shot Arrival for Denis Villeneuve, I believe. And for some reason, I don't know, either he didn't completely white balance, or he decided that everything needed to be as dark as possible to the point of everyone is a silhouette in every shot. But a lot of the shots look really murky and dark, and they're relatively hard to see. And I think one of the reasons why could also be that I believe this film was digitally photographed. And without a lot of lighting, digital can get kind of murky and muddy. So there's not much color in the picture. It's rather flat. It looks like just raw footage, not necessarily as color-corrected as you would expect a Star Wars film to be. Usually Star Wars films are pretty colorful. And I think that they wanted that, because they were trying to express a certain tone with this criminal underworld and sort of a darker, I guess, story. But what's funny to me about that is it's really not all that dark of a story, because what happens in the movie generally deals with Han Solo doing all of the Han Solo things that we expected Han Solo to do in a Han Solo origin story. He, meets Chewbacca, he gets the Millennium Falcon. He does, of course, the Kessel Run. So the argument can be made, did we need any of these things? No, not necessarily. But arguably, the movie does a pretty admirable job of expressing all of these ideas, and they're not too offensive. I would argue that one of the more offensive things that the film does is explain something that does not need to be explained, which is the origin of Han Solo's name. Why is he named Han Solo? I kind of just always assumed that was his name. A lot of people in Star Wars have some pretty strange names, and you don't really think twice about it. But for some reason, the filmmakers felt that it was incredibly important that we stop the movie for a moment and allow Han to walk up to an Imperial officer in a recruitment facility and not be able to provide a last name when asked, and then allow for this random Imperial officer to just sort of mull it over for a moment and declare, well, you're alone all the time? Solo. Yeah, that's right. Your last name is Solo, which is just sort of odd. And I also read somewhere recently that the movie was literally greenlit because of that pitch. That Lawrence Kasdan apparently talked to Bob Iger, the head of Disney, and gave him his pitch for a Han Solo independent film. And he said, he wanted to explore the origins of Han Solo's name, and that is where it came from. That he walks up to be recruited into the Empire as a pilot, and when they ask him for his name, he doesn't really have one because he was either adopted or ran away or an orphan or what have you. And so an Imperial officer deems him Han Solo, and the rest is history. He just takes that name and sticks with it for the rest of his life for whatever the heck reason. So not necessarily handled in the best way. The other thing that was kind of weird is Woody Harrelson, who Woody's a great actor, but for God's sakes, he just takes me out of every picture he's in because I just look at him and I think of him bartending from Cheers, and I just can't really get into him as any other character. But he portrays this fellow Tobias Beckett, who is sort of a mentor to Han and is what Han kind of becomes. He's a scoundrel. He's, knocking over banks, basically. He's part of the criminal underworld, and he's looking to put together crews to assist him with all of his heists and nefarious deeds that he is performing for these criminal underworld people. One night around a campfire, because again, every movie needs to have a campfire scene with a conversation for some reason, he's building his weapon and takes part of it apart and throws it to Han because he needs a gun for the heist tomorrow. And lo and behold, it is the very same blaster pistol that Han Solo runs around with for the rest of his life as well. So we have to see Han Solo get his gun for some reason. It's not really a good reason either. Nothing really, there's no story behind it. It just happens to be the random weapon that his mentor in this film hands him, and he keeps it. I don't know if it's because he's, sentimental over it, or if it's just a really darn good gun, but he has it for the rest of his life, and we see him receive it here. The sabacc game in which Han wins the Falcon from Lando Calrissian, what was interesting is that the first game he actually loses, and I appreciated that because it was unexpected. It isn't until the end of the picture when he is now aware of the fact that Lando cheats at cards that he rigs the game for himself and wins the Falcon at the end. And then, of course, we have to see the Kessel Run. Now, the Kessel Run was always, it's like an argument between fans what the Kessel Run was and what the 12 parsecs claim means. In A New Hope, Han Solo sits down at the table with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke, and he's accompanied by Chewie, and they start chatting about, hey, we got to get off Tatooine, we got to get off planet, we got to get to Alderaan. We'll pay you some money under the table, it'll be awesome. We don't have a lot of money now, but we just sold our speeder. We got a little bit, and we'll give you a whole bunch more when we get to Alderaan, because we're going to go see Princess Leia, and we have money, and yada yada. And Han tells them, well, cool, yeah, it's no big deal. I can get you there real quick because I have the Millennium Falcon. And they just sort of look at him like, okay, what does that mean? Who cares? And he's like, you've never heard of the Millennium Falcon? And they're like, no, should we have? And he says, yeah, it's the fastest ship in the galaxy. I made the Kessel Run in just 12 parsecs. Now, for years, fans debated, well, what is a parsec and what does that actually mean to do something within 12 parsecs? There was an argument against it being either a unit of time or a measurement of distance. What does it mean? Is it 12 parsecs of time, or is it over the course of 12 parsecs, like miles or something? And so this film finally shows us it's actually a matter of distance. And what occurs is Han, being Han, instead of following the little glowy, floating in space street lights that dictate where you're supposed to fly when you're doing a Kessel Run, he thinks, no, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to fly off the beaten path into asteroids and through space monsters and giant space octopuses and whatever else is out there, and do it even quicker by taking a shortcut. So essentially all it is a shortcut. And how the Falcon being fast changes that doesn't really line up or make sense, but the ride is fun. It's relatively interesting. Some of the effects work was kind of uneven and strange. I wasn't necessarily a huge fan of the black hole maw situation that was very reminiscent of J.J. Abrams' 2009 Star Trek film, where they're trying to escape a black hole at the end of that as well and go to warp. There's sort of the cliched, let's put the special juice that we stole into the engine so that the engine goes faster, and then we'll, fly out of here and we'll lickety-split and we'll all be alive and everything will be great again. But other than that, Kessel Run, fun. In fact, it was possibly a better climax to the picture than the actual climax of the picture, because once they do the Kessel Run and they get to the planet of, I believe it's called Savarine, and meet back up with Paul Bettany's evil drug dealer character guy that's running the criminal underworld, or at least you think he is, Dryden Voss, I believe is the character's name. They hang out again on his space yacht, and then everybody proceeds to double and triple cross one another for the next 10 minutes until the movie ends, and Han Solo shoots first. Han Solo basically blows away Woody Harrelson for betraying him and everyone else, and then we have the reveal of the true villain of the piece, apparently Darth Maul. So again, not the greatest of Star Wars stories, not the best Star Wars movie, but again, surprisingly enjoyable considering all of the factors that went into the making of this thing and how it is being received. I actually had fun with it. I enjoyed it. There are, of course, elements that I did not enjoy. I'm sure some people out there think that L337 is an amazingly great character. I kind of felt that she was sort of annoying, and I wasn't actually that disturbed by the fact that she gets blown up towards the end of the movie when they're on Kessel. I did find it interesting that her brain gets downloaded into the Millennium Falcon, which kind of helps make the Millennium Falcon yet more of a character and adds weight to the line from The Empire Strikes Back when C-3PO is standing there poking around in the computer and saying that to Han, he doesn't understand the gibberish that the Falcon is giving him because the computer on board has the most interesting of dialects. So that's kind of funny, because now you can think back to Solo when watching Empire and think to yourself, well, that's because L3 is in there. And then that also helps inform why the Millennium Falcon is the best ship and fastest ship in the galaxy, is because the navigational charts that were in L3's brain are also now aboard the Falcon. One last little piece that I thought was kind of fun is Enfys Nest, who is the, you think, villain of the piece, or at least the main antagonist, who is also trying to steal the space fuel. Turns out she's actually with the rebellion, and she is female and quite young, but it is she who places the very first tracker aboard the Millennium Falcon that every subsequent person seems to be using throughout the entire series of films, from Darth Vader all the way to Han Solo himself when he gets the Falcon back again in The Force Awakens. Another little callback that I thought was kind of funny is Woody Harrelson on Kessel decides to wear the exact same outfit that Lando Calrissian uses in order to infiltrate Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi. So I guess that outfit has just stayed on board the Falcon for, 30 years. so that he can use that again later on. So there you have it. I mean, I guess that's sort of a review of Solo. I just sort of talked about the movie a bit, things that I liked, things that I didn't necessarily care for. But like I said, on the whole, it's actually a lot better than I expected. I think it's better than most people would expect. And I think it's, it's fun. It's probably worth seeing. It's worth checking out. But take it as you will. I'm not going to defend, the choices that Disney made with The Last Jedi, and I'm not going to, I don't begrudge anyone who is making a conscious choice not to support this corporation by handing over additional money if you were really that burned by the last picture. But I think time heals all wounds, and I think that we've got a year and a half now between this release of Solo and Episode 9. So maybe a nice little break like this of a year and a half will actually help, and people will be able to, heal from the wounds and their hurts, if everybody's as butthurt as I was over something that's, as silly as a movie. But, Star Wars is important to a lot of people. It's certainly important to me. I wouldn't sit here and opine on it for 40 minutes if I didn't actually give a crap about this, world and its characters, and especially the film history of, the original pictures and what they've meant to me over the course of my 40 years on this planet. And so we treat it with kid gloves. We want the people that are involved to love it as much as we do. We do not want a cynical handling or a corporate capitalistic only handling of this thing that we have cared about and, spent a lot of our lives with. We want it treated with the love and tender care and respect that we feel that it deserves. And especially when there are these filmmakers that call themselves fans, that grew up with it as we have, if they get a chance to be involved in something as special and wonderful as Star Wars, we want those filmmakers to also treat it with that same level of respect and love and care, because, this is a flame that's been going for 40 years, and when it's handed down generation to generation like this, we've got to protect it to make sure that we can pass it on to our own children, and I think that's pretty much what Disney wants. If they're sinking, $2 or $3 billion into building Star Wars lands in their parks, if nobody likes the movies, they're not going to be going to the park to walk around in the Star Wars land, so they better get their act together and do it right. So anyway, that's our episode, kids. I really appreciate you tuning in. I thank you very much for your time, as always. I look forward to discussing more Star Wars news with you next week. I appreciate your patience in waiting for these episodes. I'm sorry that they've been late with the holiday and with my own birthday. But we'll be trying to come at you more regularly moving forward. We've also moved the pod now onto YouTube, so please look for it there on that platform. You can, of course, contact me on Twitter at Falcon Dish. I'd love to hear your opinions on Solo, A Star Wars Story, and let's discuss. And I'd also love to hear all of your pitches for topics for additional episodes coming down the pike. And again, as cheesy as it may sound, may the Force be with you.